So thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Jen Scott Curwood. I'm an associate professor in the Sydney School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. Today I'll be sharing some of my research on poetry and storytelling. So a bit about my background. I've got 25 years of experience as a high school English teacher, university teacher educator, and literacy researcher. And today I'll be talking about some of the work that I did as a high school teacher, and then to my current work with spoken word poetry and storytelling. So let me just share my screen here. So I want to begin by thinking about the relationship between poetry and storytelling. Now, storytelling is at the heart of Australia's new cultural policy. It's very relevant to our discussion today. We talk about how poetry is a vital necessity of our existence. This is Audre Lorde. It's through poetry that we gain clarity, nurture hope, and cultivate empathy in the face of adversity and oppression. Gotchell says that humans are storytelling animals. And I believe that poems allow us to craft stories that reveal our vulnerabilities whilst also acting as a testament to our resilience. My own interest in poetry was sparked when I started teaching high school 25 years ago. And 25 years ago is before we had a lot of the social media platforms, the tools and the modes that we do today. And poetry was an integral unit for most of our years when I was teaching in the Midwestern US. And that's where I conducted my first study as a researcher. So I engaged in an action research study focused on digital poetry. And so with digital poetry, we thought about how young people could craft their own poems, then add different modes of representation as part of creating a digital poem they would use with either like iMovie or like PowerPoint or another tool. And so with our students, we thought about, okay, if you're crafting your own poetry in response to poems that we're reading. So for instance, our students would read Walt Whitman's I Hear America Singing, and then we'd read African-American poets, Langston Hughes' poem, I Too Sing America. And we'd ask our students to think about, well, what is your America like? They craft their own poem, and then in the course of creating a digital poem, they would add different images or video, the ones they'd found online or ones that they collected, audio, whether it was like diegetic or non-diegetic sound, and transitions. And so we thought about how digital poetry allows young people to bring voices and experiences into the classroom in a way that was personally meaningful to them. And it's a way to really transform our poetry unit in a lot of ways. Years later, I had the opportunity to research on online poetry. There's a number of different online spaces. The one in this study was called figment.com, which has since evolved in many ways since then. But in online spaces, there's a lot of ways young people are gathering together to cultivate their poetic literacy in ways that are situated and collaborative. And in this study with honor student Lizzie Patchett, we found that the reciprocal nature of collaboration fueled their passion and motivation, and mentor texts were vital to their creative process. And it's really interesting because now within the New South Wales English curriculum, mentor texts are quite fundamental across stages 4, 5, and 6, as we work with teachers and teachers work with students to consider the craft of writing that's inherent in these mentor texts and what it means for their own original creative work. I've also looked at Insta poetry. I'm really fascinated in how digital tools like Instagram can be used to both create and share poetry. And this in a lot of ways goes back to my original work with digital poetry, because with Instagram, you could share just the text, right? Or you could add images or art or even like music and sound nowadays to enhance the understanding of the poem. And so this study with honor student Kate Kovalik, we looked at how young people were using Instagram and incorporating different multimodal elements, text, images, and to share with a wider audience. Because with Insta poetry, when you add hashtags from different poetry communities or keywords, you can reach a real authentic global audience. So building on all of this research that I've conducted within schools and online spaces, I started to get really interested in spoken word poetry. As a literacy researcher, I've definitely had those moments where I walk into a space and I know that there's something special happening. And all I want to do is like learn more about it. In 2015, I had my first experience attending the Bankstown Poetry Slam. I'm located in Bankstown, which is in Western Sydney, which is the most linguistically and culturally diverse area of Australia. The Bankstown Poetry Slam hosts monthly spoken word events that bring together members of the community. So at a slam that's hosted at the Bankstown Arts Center, you'll typically have about 150 to 200 people in the audience. And poets will, if they're keen to present that night, they'll put their name into a hat and they're randomly selected. Now it is competitive. So any poet that's called up, they've got 3 minutes and no more to get up and share their original poem. They could use like their phone or paper if they haven't had it memorized, or they could just recite it from memory. And so it is competitive. So we'll have judges often chosen from the audience who will then judge and rank each poet's performance. The first time I attended the Bankstown Poetry Slam over 8 years ago at this point, sitting in the audience, I just had a profound sense of what was happening as the speaker was sharing their story, the reciprocity that was happening between the storyteller and the audience, and the moments of catharsis that was often experienced from the poet and the audience members. So I was able to write a grant and I got support from UNESCO to conduct a long-term ethnographic study of the Bankstown Poetry Slam. And what I found is poetry is a really powerful way for young people to reclaim their voices in order to depict themselves fully and fairly whilst engaging in the ongoing dialectical and reflective process of identity construction. And like a growing amount of research in the US and UK in particular has found that spoken word is an increasingly popular form of creative expression, particularly among marginalized youth whose voices have historically been silenced. Spoken word at its core encourages youth to engage in storytelling, develop literate identities, and cultivate a sense of belonging and purpose. This is Sarah Mansour. She is the co-founder of the Bankstown Poetry Slam, which recently celebrated their 10-year anniversary. She is a lawyer, she is a poet, she's an activist, also a mother. We had babies 2 years ago, just days apart, so we've bonded over that as well. And so Sarah has been really instrumental in supporting the research that I've done with the Bankstown Poetry Slam and helping to cultivate a research practice partnership that we've had for 8+ years at this stage. Within the Bankstown Poetry Slam, there will be monthly events, but they also run workshops in schools as part of the Real Talk workshops that I'll be talking more about today. And they'll run like other events. They host like the National Youth Poetry Slam and other like workshops as well. What I'm going to do right now is share a bit from a 15-minute documentary that I produced as part of my UNESCO-funded research. I won't share the full 15 minutes, but I think hearing some interviews from the poets, hearing some examples of spoken word poetry can do more than me just telling you about them. So I'll share a little bit from this documentary that was produced by Peter Watson. Share this real quick.
They ask me where I'm from, and I struggle to tell them that I am cedar on eucalyptus lands, that I am from the land that will one day consume our bodies 6 feet under, that I am from the land that today consumes me because it makes me wish that I was 6 feet under, that I am transplanted heart in rejecting body, that I wish you knew that I am somebody, that I am a rose in the barrel of an AK-47, and I am inspired because I am only ever exotically desired and only ever really required to fill a quota. They ask me where I'm from, and I tell them that I am fully sick. What they don't know is that I am also fully sick and tired of people seeing this hijab, this melanin, this name. I tell them where I'm from, but all I get in response is hipsters trying to claim my tabuli, my hummus, my falafel. You will gladly swallow up my culture, but spit me out because I make you uncomfortable. Because I am just as Australian as you are and just as immigrant as you are, but you are still uncertain of where I'm from. They ask me where I'm from, and I tell them that my first breath of air was in a hospital room on Eldridge Road in Bankstown, that my foundations are snow-capped Lebanese mountains and the rest of me is only just perishable blue, I tell them that my first breath of air should have been Mediterranean Sea, sand and stars, but you pillaged my lands and then let people like Peter Dutton conflate our flee from your terror with terrorism. So now I can only see the stars from afar. They tell me it's cloudy because I live in the city. I tell them that I can't see the stars from here because you close my curtains every night. I guess it's really just because I'm not. They ask me where I'm from, and I tell them that I am from Darug land, belonging to the Eora nation, still not forgotten for thousands of generations, that I am not a new generation of Australian, that my grandfather carried us on his back, that my grandmother gave us her backbone, but you're still convinced that I am not from the country that you claim to own. But I know that the next time someone asks me where I'm from, I'll still struggle to tell them, because it's hard for me to comprehend that this land makes me feel so alone, but I somehow still call Australia home.
The poets traditionally are the ones who are holding the mirror to ourselves and saying, this is happening and there is a better way. Why don't we choose the better way? And sharing the human experiences, just like humour can actually catch the saddest truth. I think poetry shows reality the way it is better than any other art form. So I think we need to start respecting it a lot more. If I had to describe Poetry Slam to someone who has never heard of Poetry Slam before, I would say it's 2 to 3 minutes on the microphone, watching someone pour their heart and soul out to a crowd.
A poetry slam is basically just a storytelling evening. We have some poets who have written their own original work. They get up on the stage and they perform it, and the crowd in response clicks and shows support. And it's very much an interactive kind of space, and it feels very much like a family, because there's no room for hatred, there's no room for bigotry. It is about people coming together to express solidarity, to express their ideas on things that are important to them, and to really connect with other people. For some people, it's very much a tool to express angst or to connect on an issue that they're really passionate about. And for some other people, it's just a means to show their identity, to connect with the audience and prove who they are.
How we run a slam is
so I just want to pause it there. So who you heard from the very beginning was Layla, and she's going to feature into some of the data that I'm sharing a little bit. And this is Yasmin Lewis, and we also had Sarah Mansour there. Let's get back to the slides here. Okay, so what began 8 years ago as this research practice partnership with the Bankstown Poetry Slam has allowed me to engage in a number of different studies, and I'm really grateful for the connections that I have with the poets and the organizers as part of the slam. So I conducted a multi-year ethnographic study of the Bankstown Poetry Slam, how that existed within the community space, and I've also been able to look a little bit more closely at some of the other initiatives. The Bankstown Poetry Slam has been attacked by some conservative politicians over the years, including in 2018 when Mark Latham labeled it Islamic political ranting and called into question why it received any kind of government funding. The vitriol from him and others like him included threats to the slam and to the organizers, and so they had to hire security. And to me, it's a real testament about how the storytelling that can take place in spaces like poetry slams can be really unsettling to the status quo and quite threatening to the power that they perceive themselves to hold. As part of my research here, I felt it challenged my methodology and my approach, because I was asking poets to share themselves, not just on stage, but in interviews. And I felt like if I was truly going to understand spoken word, I needed to perform as well. Over 25 years of teaching, I've taught a lot of classes, given a lot of lectures, given keynotes to hundreds of people. But the 3 minutes when I got on stage and shared an original spoken word poem were probably the most terrifying. But it was really interesting in terms of the creative process, right? Like, what story do I want to tell? What kind of reaction do I want from my audience? How can my life, which is very different from a lot of theirs, how can we still have a mutual connection and empathy and catharsis? So as part of my work, I've written and shared poetry as part of this project. And I've also engaged in some poetic inquiry, including through the use of tools like Instagram. So some of my research has been published as like poetic inquiry as part of the data analysis, but I've also shared it a bit more widely, including like using hashtags on Instagram as part of processing the data and thinking a little bit about how some of the key themes were emerging or my reactions after different interviews or attending different slams. So I think that this study over the years has challenged me in terms of my work as a qualitative researcher and encouraged me to invent my own kind of methodological considerations and approaches. So what I want to focus on today is one of the initiatives of the Bankstown Poetry Slam, which is their Real Talk workshops. So Real Talk workshops are run in schools, typically in Western and Southwestern Sydney, and they run over a 6-week period. So the questions I want us to think about today are the mentor poets. How do they share their craft through modeling the writing process and demonstrating performance techniques within a framework of culturally sustaining pedagogy? And how do mentor poets encourage young people to engage in critical conversations, explore their own intersectional identities, and wield poems as tools for social justice? Now, with the Real Talk workshops that the Bankstown Poetry Slam runs, typically there'll be around a dozen schools that participate each year, and they enlist mentor poets who are often young poets, typically between the ages of like 20 and 30, to lead the workshops. And it's an interesting third space that's created, right? Because it's happening within the school, but it's not part of the curriculum. The teacher isn't the one doing it. We have these young, energetic, youth poets that are coming in, and it creates a really interesting space for young people to engage in writing and creativity and sharing and storytelling in a different way than they might typically do as part of the curriculum that is often marked by high stakes assessment. And so in the year of this study, we had 14 schools that took part, and we had 8 different mentor poets. But today for this presentation, I'll focus on 2 of them in particular. And so the first thing I want to explore together is about modeling vulnerability. And I feel that, for my work as a teacher educator, vulnerability is often part of what we do with our teaching, but it's something we often don't explicitly talk to our pre-service teachers about. My pre-service English teachers that I work with recently returned from their first placement in schools. And over the 4 weeks, they learned a lot about teaching, but they also learned a lot about themselves, right? And especially when it comes to writing and creative writing in particular, it really demands a lot, not just from their students, but also from themselves. This is Andrew Cox. The 2 poets I'll highlight today have given me permission to use their names. I do have an article under review that highlights some of this research as well. At the time of the study, Andrew was 21 years old. His family is from the Philippines, and he was still is very passionate about spoken word poetry. His motivation for getting involved in the Real Talk workshops as a mentor poet is he said, look, when I was young, there wasn't anyone who's like a really good role model for me. I didn't have anyone to look up to. I didn't have anyone who like really encouraged me, especially in this creative space. And he said, I wanted to be that for somebody else. And so within the workshops, Andrew was very conscious about how he kind of brought his creative energy in. And he said, look, my art is about the power of story. Everyone has stories, and I want to see that come out in people. And he was really passionate about believing that students had not just stories, but stories worthy of telling, stories that they needed to tell, and to tell both to themselves and to an audience, right? That extended perhaps even beyond the classroom. Because the way it worked with the Real Talk workshops is every year, about a dozen schools participate. And over the 6 weeks that the mentor poets are working in schools, they develop students' craft, not just of writing poetry, but also performing. So there's a curriculum that they follow, but they can also adapt depending on their own interests and the needs of their students. And then they have heats. So within each school, they have heats where students perform, and the best poets then compete in the slam that is at the end of the 6 weeks. And so often the slam is hosted at like a big theater in the CBD. And it allows the schools to come together so they can see their mates perform. They have a wide, authentic audience. Family, friends, other classes are invited to attend as well. And so having the competitive aspect there is real essential to spoken word. But Andrew wanted to start just with the element of story and the power of story. And so for him, it's really important to then share his own stories. So he wasn't just kind of telling young people what to do, he was showing them. And going back to like English pedagogy, this is what we say, right? Is show, don't tell. So this is an excerpt from one of his poems. He said, "Look, this is art, my beating and bleeding heart for all of you. I'll spit my feelings in the hope that you might feel something, anything, everything, all at once. The fire in your belly, the beating of your heart, the pumping of your blood sounds like music. To me, I will stand as an instrument that has always been for the audience." This excerpt from a longer poem really talked about his positionality and kind of what he felt was his responsibility as a poet in order to engage young people and to really share a piece of himself. This made me reflect on the power dynamic that we often have in schools. And so American scholars asked, what is at stake and whose interests are served in a power dynamic where only one person is asked to reveal him or herself. And this is something that I've talked to my pre-service English teachers about a lot, because I've realized, we talk to them about modeling, but then when I ask them to model, they're often deeply uncomfortable with it, right? Because like theoretically, they can tell me all about modeling and cite research and tell me why it's so important. When I say, okay, let's model, how to write, an introductory paragraph in an essay, or how do you model, writing dialogue? It's often really like disconcerting, and they find it like unsettling because then they're more confident in telling young people what to do and how to find their voices than in showing like their own voices as well. And so I think it's really powerful within the spoken word workshops when the youth poets, they shared their own creative work, and they also shared videos and resources of other spoken word poets. I know Sarah Mansour's poem My Australia is used in a number of different schools in Sydney. They look to some American poets like Rudy Francisco to highlight, here's how we tell stories, here's my stories, now what are yours? And this is Layla McKaybar. So she was the first poet that we saw earlier. She actually originally took part in a Real Talk workshop when she was a high school student. Then at the time of the study, she was 20 years old. Her older sister, Charnay, is a very avid spoken word poet, and she enlisted her in getting involved in the Bankstown Poetry Slam and also then the Real Talk workshops. So Layla was really excited to come back to Real Talk as a mentor poet because she had seen it before from the student side. And this is part of the transcript from what Layla was reading earlier. And what she often tried to do with her poems is to situate her work, within place. If we think about, Australia's like new national cultural policy that's come into place this year, both story and place are really central elements of it. And Layla rooted herself very firmly in Bankstown. And that's something that Sarah Mansour has done too with her work, including like where I'm from. One of the activities that Layla engaged her students in is a poet Banu Kapul's provocative 12 questions. One of the questions that she asks is, who are you and whom do you love? Right? And what I love about these questions is that they could be answered, with a word or two, or we can encourage young people to engage in more figurative, more expressive, more like reflective language. So Layla, just kind of in front of the class, came up with, I'm the daughter of warrior women who were laid to rest with tongues that were swollen with words that had never been said, and the words that could have been said. Within graves, each mouth was a skeleton valley, rotten with a decayed memory. So through being vulnerable and offering her own poems and her own responses, Layla was able to kind of model both the art of storytelling, also share her perspective, and engage students in a discussion about simile, about metaphor, about personification, about alliteration. And so she was able to really kind of entice them through the own work that she did as a mentor poet. Now, this isn't to say that all mentor poets were quite comfortable with being vulnerable, right? In some of the focus groups I conducted with all of the mentored poets, they struggled at various points. One queer poet said, "Look, I come out every day, constantly. Existing is coming out, but I don't want to cross boundaries in the workshops, so I just don't." Because she wasn't sure, and this is something that I've heard echoed from a number of colleagues and pre-service teachers, like, how do I, when do I, why should I reveal my sexual orientation, right? And so what she found is that as she built trust and respect within the with the young people in the workshops, she said, look, then it gets to a point where I might mention it in a poem, or when my pronouns in a poem was different to what they would expect it to be, and they figured it out on their own. So she felt like she didn't need like a major announcement, right? Because she commented at one point, she's like, look, straight people wouldn't just announce their sexuality one day, right? And so she felt like with hers, she was mindful of being in a school setting, working with young people who are often, 14, 15 years old. And so this is something that she wrestled with, like how to incorporate these aspects of her identity within her own storytelling. Within this particular year, we observed young people in the workshops, and 3 different young people chose to come out in the course of the workshop. It was something that wasn't on the lesson plan, wasn't even directly in relation to a particular prompt, but because they felt so comfortable, because vulnerability had been modeled to them, because there have been explicit discussions about intersectional identities, they felt comfortable in coming out. Which leads me to the idea of culturally sustaining pedagogy. One of my professors when I was at the University of Wisconsin at Madison was Gloria Latson-Billings, and it's and her work has like really profoundly shaped my work as a teacher and as a researcher. And so when I reflect on the Real Talk workshops and the implications for culturally sustaining pedagogy, I see it really threaded into the work that the poets did. And so I really feel like the workshops drew on this culturally sustaining pedagogy, encourage young people to both interrogate and celebrate their intersectional identities through crafting their poems. For immigrant youth in particular, culturally sustaining pedagogy can recognize and build on their linguistic and cultural capital, by valuing their unique identities as immigrants, and fostering a critical and inclusive citizenship. And we're living in a very interesting time. And what I've heard from Sarah and from some other friends, working with young people, working across schools, is a lot of teachers are uncertain whether and how to bring in current events into the classroom, how and why to allow young people to share aspects of their identity, think about what kind of stories they can tell. And I think that because the poets within the workshop really modeled the vulnerability, it allowed them to embrace a culturally sustaining approach to pedagogy. Something that I found really profound within the workshops is the stories the young people told. And I think we've all had those moments with teaching where we just know that there's something really special happening in that moment. And so it isn't just about what's happening for the storyteller, it's also what happens with the audience too. This quote from Elizabeth Dutro really resonated with me. She says, when facing the reconstruction of a person's difficult experience, we enter a moment of disequilibrium. Our visceral unsteadiness is our entree to witnessing, if we dare allow it to be. So the idea of witnessing and bearing witness, I think, is really important to spoken word, whether it's happening within school spaces or within community contexts. And there's something really profound about listening and bearing witness to someone's story, whether it's one that resonates directly with yours or whether that is so polar opposite from the life experience you've had to date. And I think that moment of listening, of experiencing, of empathizing, of witnessing is something that's really powerful. And I think it's often something that we don't create space for within formal school contexts enough. And so the idea of bearing witness was really essential to what I observed within the Real Talk workshops. So let me just share a poem right now. This is from 2 poets. So what happened is they both won the heats of their respective schools, and they're put together for the slam at the very end. And they said, okay, you need to compose a new collaborative poem to perform on stage. There.
Hey, Shanvi, did you hear about how Ashley divorced her freaking husband and now her dad's like disowning her or something?
Oh my gosh, what about the girl that looked her husband straight in his eyes?
How dare she?
I know, what is...
Shh. There are people here.
Sorry.
I am a brown woman, as you can see.
With your two eyes placed upon your face.
I am a brown woman with my skin soaked in melanin and flowing with honey.
With my hair thicker than the clouds in the skies, my eyes darker than the deepest nights.
I am a brown woman. I am proud of who I am.
I love my culture.
I love how the clothes are splattered with patterns and vibrant like the birds in the Amazon.
I love who I am. I love the respect we give one another and the Bollywood tunes you could dance to all night long.
I love how jollof rice is made with love and served with pride.
I love how everything we eat is soaked in hundreds of spices.
I am a brown woman. I am proud of who I am.
And even when we move to the land flowing with milk and honey, I'm still who I am.
But the expectations I am forced to carry lay heavy on my spine. And the fact that I have scoliosis isn't really helping.
Expected to wait on anyone and everyone, to sit patiently like a silent servant.
Expected to cook and clean, tedious tasks that I was born to do.
Expected to wait on everyone and to cook and clean and everything that I was absolutely born to do.
Expected to believe every idiotic sense of the word, to have a slimmer waist,
fairer skin,
long luscious hair,
smaller boobs.
As if we can control that. My body has been turned into a product that I am not allowed to buy.
Expected to not just respect our elders, but believe that every command,
even if it's wrong, I am a brown woman. I am proud of every part of me. My expectations give me the ability to endure, to fight. I can still hold my ground, especially when the elder male tells me how to live my life so that it's perfect.
Especially when I'm told that I need a husband, that I can't survive without a man by my side.
Forgive me, I can still live much better on my own, especially when I can't choose whether to be on birth control.
Because God forbid that my husband wants a child using my body.
But little do they know, I have already started to blossom into the strong woman I was destined to be.
And that they cannot control my destiny.
And with the help of this brown girl,
I can overcome my expectations.
I can overpower the male dominance.
I can call her my friend.
But I thought we were sisters.
Call her my sister.
And together we will conquer the world, because we are brown women. We love our cultures. We are proud of who we are. We are proud of where we come from, even if it sucks, and we don't take shit from no one.
So that was Ifeoma and Shanvi. Ifeoma she is the daughter of Nigerian immigrants. Shanvi, the daughter of Indian immigrants. They hadn't met before the Real Talk workshops brought them together, because again, they had won the heats in their respective schools. And then for this Grand Slam, they're asked to compose a collaborative poem. So even though they came from their parents and families and cultures are very different, they bonded over a lot of the shared expectations that were placed upon them, the tensions that they felt as they navigated race, gender, culture, immigration. And so one thing that Ifeoma said, she said, look, there's a lot of misogyny in both of our communities. We want that to change, or at least in our homes. And through their conversations with one another, they really thought about how they were often positioned within their families, who they loved and respected, right? But they also thought about how the expectations put on them as young women were different. And they looked at their mothers and how their mothers were navigating that space. And they thought about how they wanted to as they grew and came into their own. One of Ifeoma's poems that she wrote within the Real Talk workshops is this. So, I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl. You love to compare death and demise to darkness until you see me. I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl. I'm taught not to call myself a Black girl too many times because I'm taught I'm insignificant. No one wants to hear you wolf and bark. Another one of those Black girl poems beside other Black bitches. I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl, I'm a Black girl. So through the work that Ifeoma did with the Mentor Poet and the Real Talk workshops, she thought about her use of alliteration, her use of repetition, her use of imagery, her use of personification, and how that is something she could weave into the poems that she was writing, and how that could reflect her experience as a Black girl growing up in Australia. And so something that really resonated with me through my work with the spoken word is how it speaks to this new understanding of literacy that's really emerged over the past 10 to 15 years that foregrounds issues of race, class, gender, and sexuality, and focuses on how literacy really operates in relation to difference, oppression, and marginalization. and therefore being literate involves being present and active in the struggle for reclaiming one's voice, history, and future. The work of Ernest Morel and colleagues has been really inspirational, especially in relation to how we can think about literacy and how literacy is operating within these kind of spaces. One other poem I just wanted to share with you, I'll share part of this one, as she was, this is a young Muslim girl, as she's thinking, and she's writing in response to the 2013 Christchurch massacre.
The truth is that Islam is not like any other faith. It is a religious equivalent of fascism. And just because the followers of this savage belief were not the killers in this instance does not make them blameless. Dearest Stu, 5:31 a.m. Fajr prayer. Come to prayer, come to prayer. Come to success, come to success. The call to prayer is the blanket which warms my mind each and every morning. I awake with the birds as they set off for their day. The tinge of sweet, freshly picked dates sugarcoats the words which come from my mouth. As the moon loses himself to let the brightness of his beloved breathe, the sun rises to greet me and my parents as we finish our prayer. My mother's body warmth was exultating off of her. Her presence elevates me. Papa's moonlit eyes focus on me as if I was his treasure of gold. He always knew how to comfort me with just a look. My mother's home cooking had sent me into a day so deep I fought the urge to get out of it. My dainty necklace hung low, dressing my body in gold to rest assured that my exterior matched my interior. Soft. It was just my typical Friday morning. How the truth.
I just wanted to share this one because for this young girl, it was really important for her to talk about her experience of Islam and what it meant for her, her faith, and her family, and how that was often in stark juxtaposition to how she perceived Muslim people presented in news, including in response to current events and terrorist attacks. So something that really resonated with me is how the world is both revealed and constituted in words. And what I've seen within spoken word poetry through the Bankstown Poetry Slam and the Real Talk workshops is that poetry really offers these words without apology and encourages young people to share their stories in this way. It has a way of sustaining and healing our souls by serving as a tool of resistance, which can bring individuals into collective action. Some of my current research is really looking at how poetry can be a tool for civic literacy as well. So I think that Real Talk mentor poets empowered students to become change agents and wield spoken word poetry as a tool in the fight against inequity and injustice, and beginning with themselves, with their communities, with their stories, and thinking about how that could be shared more widely, beyond the classroom walls into online spaces within the community events as well. And engaging with spoken word poetry offers young people a way to engage with the ancient art of storytelling in order to build a more equitable and sustainable future. For a lot of the young people that I interviewed and the mentor poets we talked to in focus groups, they really drew on how storytelling was part of their culture and how growing up they had witnessed it in a variety of ways. And this was just a new way, either through the Real Talk workshops, through the Bankstown Poetry Slam, through online channels, through their own Insta poetry, a way for them to tell stories and to connect with others and be vulnerable and experience catharsis. So that is my talk for today. Here you have my email address, Twitter as well. So feel free to reach out and get in touch. And I've also included some of the citations from the work that I talked about today. And this kind of goes through my work with digital poetry, online poetry, instant poetry, and spoken word poetry as well. So I'm happy to take any questions that might either be asked live or pop into the chat as well.
Thank you very much, Jen, for that really insightful and interesting snapshot of a critical and creative pursuit in our youth culture. I should say that today we meet, of course, or I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people, who are, of course, our oldest storytellers and poets. So we acknowledge our elders past, present, and emerging for the gift of that storytelling. Jen, your work is so diverse and so critical to amplifying and giving agency to the voice of young people. I just wanted to ask if there is anybody in the audience who would like to ask a question, or as Jen has said, we make our webinars with Create freely available, and I know a lot of people like to use them almost like podcasts to kind of reflect on and disseminate and discern the material at their own pace. But I'll throw open the floor if anybody would like to ask a question at this point.
I have a question, Jen. In your, some of those videos and the performances of the poetry are stunning. I was wondering if you could tell me what you sort of think is the difference between performing the poetry and, the benefits of just reading it. What are kind of the affordances that are made apparent through the performance of the slam poetry?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I really appreciate how this reflects your background with theater and performance. It's interesting, right? So with young people, we know that in school settings, speech is something that we need to assess them on, and one of the different language modes that we need to include is part of our teaching and part of our assessment. But often speech is just often reading aloud, maybe think about eye contact, maybe a bit of gesture. But I think within the Real Talk workshops, they really try to model for young people how it's more embodied and how it's more performed. They showed examples of how spoken word poets might use even like instruments and music. They might sing. They might use gesture more freely, more pointedly. And I think that the embodied aspect of spoken word poetry is something that was intuitive to some of the young people, but to others made them very uncomfortable, because I think that some young people thrive and put them in front of the classroom, give them a captive audience, and they will rise to the occasion. For others, that's probably the most terrifying moment of the entire school year, when they have to be that one person in front of the classroom and performing. Even those of us who are adults can probably relate to that. And so the poets had to do a lot of different activities that got the young people up, moving around, trying to embody or reflect different personas or different moods, just to kind of bring them back into their bodies in that way, because sometimes that can be quite, I think for some people, it's almost like their lives are lived or perceived more like on the screen, as they're performing, on TikTok and Snapchat and Instagram and Facebook. And so to bring them back kind of into the present, into their bodies, how they're feeling, how they're expressing, and to encourage them to be in tune with that, and to relate to that, I think is something that was really important. And then kind of building that skill and that confidence and that support, where they did feel safe then when they did get in front of the classroom and they did perform. It didn't feel like they were putting their identities or their reputations at risk. They felt like it was being received in a safe space. So that really had to be like scaffolded and modeled and really supported throughout the workshops, because it was, like I said, some young people just intuitively were performers and happy to have the captive audience, and other young people really needed that support throughout the whole process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jen. That's a great answer. I know, speaking from our experience, Thomas, in creativity, teacher artistry, and we've had engagement with poets. A lot of our students in those workshops like to write in their first language too. And that allows for that particular connection and confidence in, I guess, the embodied experience. I think we're okay in the chat, Thomas. Is there another question from the floor? If not, we will make all Jen's material available through our Create website, and all those rich references and certainly the visual material. Well, thank you very much, Jen, for this really illuminating conversation about spoken word poetry and vulnerability and the power of the embodied, giving voice and agency to young people. It's been a real pleasure to have you on the Create platform, and we look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you so much.
Good night, everybody.